Why was Ulysses S Grant popular with his contemporaries, while historians often placed him near the bottom in their ranks of the presidents? Was President Grant able to successfully guarantee black access to the ballot in the South? Why were thousands of blacks murdered during the 1876 election? Why were the 1876 fake electors excused, while the 2020 fake electors were prosecuted and sometimes jailed? And why were the Union troops pulled out of the former Confederate states after the 1876 election? Did this mean the end of Reconstruction? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare, which includes illustrations. Our sister blog includes footnotes, and both include our Amazon book links. General Grant owed his popularity with his contemporaries to leading the Union Army to victory in the Civil War. Many of the responsibilities he shouldered when he was president were also the same when he was the leading U.S. general. Union Civil War generals were not only responsible for fighting the war, they were also responsible for ensuring the welfare of the emancipated slaves, feeding them, educating them, employing them, and helping them to integrate into society. Grant did this as the Supreme General during the Civil War and during President Johnson's administration. So when he supported Reconstruction efforts and put down the Ku Klux Klan as president, these efforts were a continuation of his efforts as the Supreme Union General. On July 4, 1863, two Confederate armies were defeated at Vicksburg by General Grant, giving the Union control over the entire Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in two, and General Meade defeated Robert E. Lee in the bloody battle at Gettysburg. At both Vicksburg and Appomattox, Grant did not hold the surrendering Confederate troops as prisoners of war, but paroled them after they surrendered their weapons, allowing officers to keep their horses for spring planting. Thousands of blacks were murdered by white supremacists to keep them from voting in the elections held after the Civil War. After emancipation, despite the passage of the Civil War amendments abolishing slavery, guaranteeing due process and justice for blacks, and ensuring that all natural-born male citizens, including blacks, had the right to vote. After President Andrew Johnson's impeachment, as his popularity sank, Grant's reputation rose, and he was nominated by Lincoln's Republican Party to run for president without competition. After Congress passed strict enforcement acts, Grant was able to suppress the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, although other white supremacist terrorist organizations sprang up in its place. Grant easily won re-election to a second term. The South was unrepentant. Few Southerners respected the civil rights of and due process under the law for the newly freed black slaves. The Northern congressmen put the South under military rule. Union soldiers guaranteed the civil rights of the freed black slaves. Murders and crimes that could not be prosecuted in local Southern courts were tried in federal courts. But after the Panic of 1873, a deep 5-year economic depression sapped the Northern patience with stationing federal troops in the Southern states to keep the peace. We also discussed Grant's Indian policies and Custer's defeat at the Battle of Little Bighorn at the end of his second term. Would Grant run for a third term in 1876? Despite the two-term precedent set by George Washington, the first president, and despite the political damage of the continuing financial scandals of Grant's subordinates, his enduring popularity prompted leading senators to urge Grant to run for a third term. But in early 1875, Grant announced, "I am not, nor have I been, a candidate for renomination." Due to the changing political climate, Grant now dithered and delayed when facing Southern violence. For example, in September 1875, Republicans threw a barbecue in Clinton, Mississippi to rally voters. Grant's biographer Ron Chernow writes how the white supremacists reacted. Intruders from a White Lion rifle club showed up to harass them, murdered a black citizen, then opened fire on other blacks, who quickly grabbed pistols and returned fire. The gunfight left 7 or 8 blacks sprawled dead in the dust, with 3 white men killed in retaliation. Also, squads of white men were bushwhacking through the countryside, murdering and driving unarmed and defenseless colored people from their homes. Governor Ames pleaded with Grant for federal aid, but Grant, sensing the changing political climate, hesitated to act and requested that Ames exhaust all state resources before asking for federal help. Later, Grant would regret his hesitation to halt this election-related violence in Mississippi as his greatest error made during Reconstruction. Now, emboldened by federal inaction, the white liners decided to scare blacks from the polls and install a democratic government through naked terror if necessary. The local sheriff was driven off by an overwhelming armed force. Governor Ames sat brooding and besieged in the governor's mansion in Jackson. To head off threatened impeachment, he decided to resign after the election, concluding that Reconstruction was a dead letter. Turnout continues. The railroads represented a festering source of corruption, issuing free passes to Grant and other public figures, who accepted such largesse as legitimate perks of their jobs. With the post-war boom and a universal thirst for riches came a complete breakdown of public and private morality. Grant could not inoculate his administration against this epidemic, which infected both parties in every state legislature. In late October, Governor Ames warned Grant that it would be impossible to have a fair election in November without federal troops. Threats from Democrats crushed the black election turnout. In Yazoo County, only 7 Republicans voted out of a black population of over 12,000 voters. Why had Grant decided not to send federal troops to supervise the election in Mississippi? Years later, the only black Mississippi congressman to survive in that election, John Roy Lynch, recounted a discussion he had with President Grant. He was about to order the federal troops to intervene in Mississippi when he discussed the problem with Ohio Republicans. The Ohio Republicans were concerned that if Grant intervened in Mississippi, Republicans would lose the elections in October, the state having already lost faith in Reconstruction. Grant decided it was more important to retain Ohio than to save Mississippi. Republicans won the Ohio elections, returning Rutherford B. Hayes to the governorship and setting the stage for the next president. Grant admitted to Lynch, "I should not have yielded. I believed at the time I was making a grave mistake. But as presented, it was duty on one side and party obligation on the other. If a mistake was made, it was one of the head and not of the heart." He predicted that the northern retreat from Reconstruction would lead to Democrats recapturing power in the South, and that the results of the War of the Rebellion will have been in a large measure lost. Chernow wonders whether the Civil War had been fought in vain. All those hundreds of thousands dead, the millions maimed and wounded, the mourning of widows and orphans, all that suffering, all that tumult, at some level, had been for naught. Slavery had been abolished, but had been replaced by a caste-ridden form of second-class citizenship for Southern blacks, and that counted as a national shame. Although Grant was not actively influencing the choice of his successor, he favored Hamilton Fish, his competent Secretary of State. Chernow writes, "Party stalwarts agreed with the administration on Reconstruction and were prepared to turn the upcoming election into another contest of loyal Republicans versus disloyal Democrats. They would inveigh against the Klan and make emotional appeals that reminded voters of Northern sacrifice and Southern betrayal during the war. Yet a segment of the Republican Party establishment now wondered aloud whether troops should be withdrawn from the South, leading many blacks to yearn for a third Grant term. On the 7th ballot, Rutherford B. Hayes was nominated by a close vote. Grant had known him as a congressman and was initially satisfied with the choice. The party bosses were disappointed when Hayes promised civil service reform, promising not to run for a second term. And the Democrats quickly nominated Samuel Tilden, who endorsed a one-term limit for presidents and opposed patronage in the spoils system. Predictably, he opposed Reconstruction. The leading black leader, Frederick Douglass, asked what abolition had accomplished for the black man if, having been freed from the slaveholder's lash, he is to be subject to the slaveholder's shotgun. However aloof he was from campaigning in the 1876 election, Grant remained committed to the safety of black voters. One challenge was that the federal presence in the South had ebbed to slightly more than 3,000 Union troops, facing an enemy that threatened to steal the election through violence into armed insurrection. Many Northern voters were tiring of Reconstruction. The Supreme Court handed down several rulings watering down the 14th and 15th Amendment and the various enforcement acts passed to prevent abuses by white supremacists. Grant worried that a rejuvenated rebel spirit might demand compensation for freed slaves. The lost cause myth was spreading that painted the Civil War as a war of Northern aggression, celebrating the military prowess of Robert E. Lee, while dismissing Grant as a butcher who only won the war through superior numbers and material. This lost cause myth influenced historians to deprecate Grant as one of the least effective presidents. What were the issues of the two competing parties? Turnout tells us. The Democrats feasted on the frequent scandals that plagued Grant's second term and seemed to run against Grantism rather than Hayes. Republicans cast Democrats as thinly disguised slaveholders, and one prominent Republican thundering, "Every man that loved slavery better than liberty was a Democrat, and every man that raised bloodhounds to pursue human beings was a Democrat." Many of the Confederate states had already been redeemed, returning to the Democratic Party fold, but South Carolina, Florida, and embattled Louisiana remained Republican. White supremacist Democrats sought to redeem these last Republican strongholds in the South. Violence erupted on July 4, 1876, in Hamburg, South Carolina, sparked by a trivial complaint. Chernow recounts, 2 white farmers in a buggy protested that their path was barred by a parade of local black militia. Before long, militia leaders were jailed for obstructing a public highway. But white vengeance wasn't yet sated. In the coming days, armed whites, both local and from out of town, gathered in Hamburg to demand that local black militia relinquish their weapons. These blacks took refuge in a small brick building, but the swelling white mob blew out its windows with musket and cannon fire. Blacks leapt from the windows or climbed down an escape ladder only to be gunned down in cold blood. James Cook, the black town marshal, was shot and his skull smashed in with muskets. The homes of nearly every black family in town were pillaged, while mutilated bodies of the murdered men broiled in sunlight for days, their families too petrified to retrieve them. Grant hesitated to send in federal troops. Under the less forgiving political climate, he felt he needed to show that the state government first did everything it could to quell the violence. Later in the summer, over 100 blacks were murdered in Ellington, South Carolina. Finally, in October, the Republican governor informed Grant that the state forces were unable to control the insurrections. And finally, Union troops were dispatched to keep the peace. 1,000 troops were present to keep the peace on Election Day, not enough to prevent all violence, but enough to grant relative safety to black voters. But in Mississippi, very few blacks voted, fearing violence. Louisiana also witnessed atrocities listed by Chernow. On Election Day, Tilden handily won the popular vote, but the Electoral College count was split. But the 1876 election was disputed. Both parties declared victory in the unredeemed states of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, and both parties appointed a party slate of electors. If Republicans won in all 3 states, the Republicans could win the electoral count by 1 vote. Now, the 1876 election was used as precedent by the Republicans in 2020, when there were, once again, dual slates of electors in swing states, except that the courts ignored the precedent of the 1876 election, as it was likely illegal in 1876 as well. There was no doubt that the mass intimidation of black voters by Democratic white supremacists illegally threw the elections to the Democrats. Chernow recounts, though scrupulously even-handed, Grant was demonized by Southern Democrats and was peppered with death threats. He sent generals with federal troops to the 3 swing states to ensure an accurate counting of the ballots. With assistance from thousands of Rifle Club members, Democrats seized control of the South Carolina state legislature. Grant told the Union soldiers not to intervene, although he also declared that if an armed mob attacked Congress, he would defend it. Chernow writes, rumors floated about that a secret Democratic army would stage a military raid on Washington and declare Tilden the winner. To guard against this menace, Grant and Sherman redeployed troops to Washington and secured the federal arsenal along with 3 critical bridges leading to the Capitol. Now, soon after the disputed presidential election in 2000, the Republican Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist penned an account of the 1876 contested election. While it was an accurate account, he omitted many of these violent acts and threats. Congress formed an electoral commission to negotiate a settlement. An informal deal was reached where, in return for properly crediting the disputed electors to the Republicans, Rutherford B. Hayes would withdraw federal troops from the South, ending Reconstruction, beginning the Redemption era, leading to the eventual passage of the Jim Crow segregation laws, giving white supremacists free rein. Lynchings and race riots targeting blacks would go unpunished until sometime after World War II. Now, in his last message to Congress, President Grant notes, nearly 1/2 of the states had revolted against the government, And of those remaining faithful to the Union, a large percentage of the population sympathized with the rebellion and made an enemy in the rear almost as dangerous as the honorable enemy in the front. Journal observes, Grant took office when much of the South lay under military rule. By the time he left, every southern state had been absorbed back into the Union. For a long time after the Civil War, influenced by Southern historians, Reconstruction was viewed as a catastrophic error, a period of corrupt carpetbag politicians and illiterate black legislators, presided over by the draconian rule of Ulysses S Grant. Journal continues, for more recent historians led by Eric Foner, Reconstruction has been seen as a noble experiment in equal justice for black citizens, in which they have made remarkable strides in voting, holding office, owning land, creating small businesses and churches, and achieving literacy. And these recent historians have built on the efforts of W.E.B. Du Bois, the first black scholar to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard for his groundbreaking book, Black Reconstruction, where he countered the lost cause myth that Reconstruction was a low point in American history, but instead argued that American democracy was strongest in the years following the Civil War, and that the blacks played a key role in the Union victory in that great war. White historians, mainly Charles Dunning, permitted Du Bois to make presentations arguing his history, but while treating him with respect, nevertheless his narrative was ignored. But W.E.B. Du Bois's reflection would become the dominant narrative in American Reconstruction history when they were adopted by Eric Foner and other leading scholars after the 60s era championing civil rights. W.E.B. Du Bois also wrote a best-selling account of sharecropping and his autobiographical experiences and the experiences of other blacks after the Civil War in his Souls of Black Folk. Journal lists the many accomplishments of the emancipated blacks. About 2,000 blacks served as state legislators, tax collectors, local officials, and U.S. Marshals, while 14 served in the House of Representatives and 2 in the Senate. The South witnessed a civil rights movement that briefly introduced desegregation and vouchsafed a vision of functioning biracial democracy. What were his greatest accomplishments? Chernow states that Grant showed a deep reservoir of courage in directing the fight against the Ku Klux Klan and crushing the largest wave of domestic terrorism in American history. It was Grant who helped weave the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments into the basic fabric of American life. Chernow ruse. Once Reconstruction collapsed, it left Southern blacks for 80 years at the mercy of Jim Crow segregation, lynchings, poll taxes, literacy tests, and other tactics designed to segregate them from whites and deny them the vote. Black sharecroppers would be degraded to the level of debt-ridden serfs, bound to their former plantation owners. After 1877, the black community in the South steadily lost ground until a rigid apartheid separated the races completely, a terrible state of affairs that would not be fixed until the rise of the civil rights movement after World War II. Chernow concludes, one of the last hurrahs of Reconstruction was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, enacted by lame duck Republicans. It outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations, schools, transportation, and juries. But Democratic governors never bothered to enforce it, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional in 1883. Many of these provisions were revived by the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, pushed through Congress by LBJ. The historian Eric Foner, in his History of the Civil War Amendments, the Second Founding, discusses how the Confederate States were brought back into the Union, the history of the enforcement of the 3 Civil War Amendments, and the Supreme Court battles fought for nearly a century until the 60s, when the civil rights sought by Reconstruction were finally enacted and enforced. After Grant's presidency, the Republican Party became more and more the party of big business, and less the party safeguarding civil rights, which meant that for many decades, blacks did not have any champions in Washington. The progressive Republican Theodore Roosevelt initially sought civil rights reforms, but the intense blowback he received when he invited the black leader Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House with his wife and children caused such intense blowback from Southern white supremacists that he concluded that this was a reform best left to later reformers. The Attorney General under Theodore Roosevelt sought unsuccessfully to end the practice of convict labor or peonage, where Southern sheriffs arrested blacks on vagrancy, loitering, or other trumped-up charges, and then leased the convicts out to mines, factories, and plantations as a type of slave labor. This reform had to wait until the presidency of his cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when comparisons between the Jim Crow discrimination against its blacks and Nazi persecutions of their Jews became politically embarrassing. In our reflections of W.E.B. Du Bois during his tenure at the NAACP, we reflected on how the presidents in between Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt did little to advance or protect the civil rights of blacks. We also reflected on David Levering Lewis's biography of Martin Luther King and his many civil rights struggles, such as the Montgomery bus boycotts, lunch counter sit-ins, and freedom bus riders, which were protests for equal access to public accommodations, the brutalities faced by protesters in Birmingham, his I Have the Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, bloody protests and martyrdoms in Mississippi and Selma, and his final protests in Chicago and Memphis before his assassination. Although John F. Kennedy raised awareness of the need for civil rights when he was assassinated, the first Civil Rights Act was stuck in Congress. Martin Luther King partnered with President Lyndon Johnson to pass the revolutionary Great Society civil rights legislation, finally granting blacks due process and voting rights. These efforts would have been thwarted if the NAACP attorneys Thurgood Marshall and Charles Houston had not challenged the Jim Crow segregation laws in the courts, leading up to the Supreme Court Brown decision. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. We discuss best-selling Ron Chernow's biography, Grant, and our reflections on his conflicts with President Johnson and his role as Union General in Reconstruction during Johnson's presidency. We summarized and skipped over many of his accounts of the election-related violence in the swing states of Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana in particular, and how his wife Julia was reluctant to leave her job as hostess of the White House. And since we previously recorded a video specifically on the contested election of 1876, where the white supremacist Democrats had opposing slates of fake electors, we likewise summarized and skipped over some of the electoral violence in that election where thousands of black voters lost their lives. And we realized that the author of the history of that election, Supreme Court William Rehnquist, chose not to report on much of this murderous violence. Ron Chernow is a guest on many YouTube videos promoting his biography on Grant, so check them out. Sometime in the future, we're planning a summary reflection of Grant's biography, covering his youth and his role in the Mexican War. That was one spark that eventually ignited the Civil War. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.